So you've got your telescope pointed at a galaxy, you start a nice long exposure, you patiently wait for 2 or 3 minutes to finally see what was recorded, and oh look, your beautiful stars are actually little worms. Congratulations, you've just invented the world's worst font. Just kidding. The culprit here, though there are a few, not in the least, is the Earth, which shockingly refuses to stop rotating because we all bought telescopes. The solution is a thing astrophotographers used to call guiding and now called auto-guiding. And no, that's not some new fancy version of cruise control. Let's dig in. So our mounts try to track the sky, but they're never perfect. Tiny gear errors, motor hiccups, temperature changes, and even voltage drops all add up. For visual astronomy, you probably will never notice it because the human eye essentially has an exposure time of around 0.1 seconds. But for photography, even a 2-second exposure can trail the stars if you don't track the sky. And even with tracking, most mounts that you and I would buy today won't give you round stars past about 30 seconds. And this isn't a modern problem. In 1880, Henry Draper pointed a telescope at the Orion Nebula and exposed a plate for 51 minutes, creating what's commonly accepted as the first image of a nebula. He guided manually, nudging the mount every few seconds. Even a few decades later, you had people like George Ritchie who were guiding 6 to 8 hour exposures at Mount Wilson on their 60-inch reflector, which was, by the way, a 40-ton instrument with a 2,000-pound mirror floating on a mercury bearing. Now, thanks to gears and slow motion controls, they weren't wrestling all 40 tons, but they were still having to make adjustments every few seconds all night long. They would literally sit at the base of one of these building-sized monsters and look through an eyepiece. They would pick a star and try and nudge the telescope to keep the star in the exact same spot the whole time, to varying effect, as you can see in some of these pictures. By the time the average hobbyist was trying to take images, the film era amateurs used illuminated reticle eyepieces. They looked sort of like normal eyepieces like this, but you can see they have this thing sticking out the side. What this is a battery and a light, and that illuminates a crosshair, and I'll put an image up of what that looks like, to give you something to try and anchor the star to, essentially. So you would still look through one of these on a telescope attached to your telescope. You would find a really bright star near the target that you were trying to image. You'd put that in the crosshairs, and then you would sit there and you would nudge the mount with your hand controller to keep the star there as long as you could handle. If you blinked too long, your exposure was ruined. If you sneezed, your exposure was ruined. If you needed to take a break, you would have to close the shutter and stop imaging. You were essentially a computer taking in visual input and translating that into nudges for the mount for the whole time you were trying to expose an image. We've been trying to solve this problem since those original photos in the 1880s, and a lot of interesting concepts have been created. So you have something like this, which is called a Lumicon Easy Guider, and this was one of the first consumer off-axis guiders. But even when this was patented, the idea wasn't new. There are patents for similar devices for military use dating back as early as the 1920s. But the concept is that in here, you can see it there, there's a little prism. That prism steals light from the edge of the light path of the telescope, so you could guide on the same optics as your film. Now, this avoided what we call flexure, which is a drift between your guide scope and your main camera, either because something isn't mounted perfectly well or because the weight's causing one thing to tilt over the other. Patents like these show the principle, which, like I said, is a prism that diverts the light for guiding up here while the main image passes through. So that sort of establishes the two popular paths in guiding that were available even back in the film days. There's guide scope guiding, where you would use, let me hold this one up, you would use a guide scope and an illuminated reticle attached to the back, or nowadays it's a small guide scope and a camera, sort of like this, bolted to the top of your telescope. Now, these are really easy to use and versatile, but there is that risk of flexure, which is really apparent when you're using really long focal lengths, so you're really zoomed in. Then there's off-axis guiding, which back then was something like this, and again, you would bolt your illuminated reticle to here. Or nowadays, there's newer versions of off-axis guiding, which look like this, but it's still the same principle. There's a prism there in the middle, and it's picking off just a little bit of light, and this one sends that light over to a camera. These are harder to set up, but they are rock solid. And like I said, these two options are still the main guiding strategies used today. By the 1990s, with advances in digital cameras and microcontrollers, companies were trying out some weird things. One company that was doing things very differently was Starlight Express. They released this unit called Active Optics, and instead of nudging your entire 50 to 100 pounds of telescope and counterweights, this unit, let me see if I can get it in there, there you go, tilts a 60 millimeter glass window that's about 12 millimeters thick. And because it only has to move such little mass, it can, in theory, correct your image hundreds of times per second, which is far faster than a normal motor mount or human could. In reality, it was probably closer to 5 to 10 times a second, which is still really good. Today, guiding can be pretty straightforward. You get yourself a guide scope and a camera, or an off-axis guider and a camera. And with software like PHD2, if you're using a Windows computer to control your astrophotography rig, it makes it really nice and simple. If you're in the Celestron universe, you can use something like this, which is a Starsense autoguiding. And within this one unit, it handles all the imaging and all the math in one sleek package that you can bolt onto the top of your telescope and connect to your Celestron mount. The ASIAIR also has guiding built in, like I mentioned earlier, and I believe it is a version of PHD2. Some newer cameras entering the market, like this 2600MC Duo, combine the imaging chip and the guide sensor into one package. This allows you to have fewer cables and less fuss, but even this concept of these dual chip cameras were first toyed with in, from what I can tell, about the 1990s. And by the way, the reason that you can't just use your main imaging camera as your guide camera is that you can't read out that picture from the sensor while you're taking a long exposure. So you need two sensors, one for guiding and one that takes the image. So that's a little bit of history and the evolution of guiding, from Draper guiding by hand in the 1880s, through reticle eyepieces in the consumer film era, to consumer off-axis guiders and their patents, quirky wiggling glass boxes, and today's guide scopes, off-axis guiders, and dual-chip cameras. Some old ideas never went away. Off-axis guiding has been here forever, and some are coming back in vogue, like the dual-chip cameras. The tools have evolved, but the goal never did. Keep your stars round and not neon worms. I'm Francisco for Deep Sky Labs. Clear skies.